guys. So there is a secret to the supplemental, which is that if I hold to my ARC review schedule for my romance novels, I will be posting this for months after I film it. But at this point, the novels, the historical and nonfiction political science stuff that I've been reading, it's getting a little bit out of hand. And I need to tell you guys about these books before I completely forgot that I read them, like 3 months from now. And I realized as I was going through this long list of books that's kind of piling up that there are some themes to some of the books that I've been reading, which is not always the case. But this one is about the law and the justice system. I'm sure that that's thrilling. If it's not, you can feel free to leave. I will say that this is not a topic that normally is of interest to me. I think the law is quite dry. I'm not a person who watches even the legal dramas on TV. It's not my thing. But I have 5 books here that I read that at the very least were interesting, and in some cases were actually incredible books that I felt like I took a lot away from and definitely taught me some things that I didn't know. So I have 5 of those and we'll talk about it. So part of this was inspired by what feels like ages ago now. I read a book by one of the investigators on the Mueller investigation, and I thought that that was a really interesting read to see behind the curtain, if you will, on what happened there. I will say that, of course, for that author, hindsight is 2020, and I did feel like there was a little bit of well, I could have done this better than Robert Mueller, but it's fine. I really thought it was interesting, and so I was watching some clips from Jon Stewart's podcast on YouTube, and he interviewed a lifelong friend, Jeffrey Berman, who is a Republican and was the head of the Southern District of New York, which is a huge state level investigative unit for the state of New York. And he was appointed by the Trump administration, and he also resigned during the Trump administration. And he wrote a book about what transpired during that time. The book is called Holding the Line: Inside the Nation's Preeminent U.S. Attorney's Office and Its Battle with the Trump Justice Department. Again, that's by Jeffrey Berman. Now, again, from what I just said and the subtitle, you might be thinking, oh, well, this is literally just about Jeffrey Berman's interactions on a daily basis with the Trump administration and things that the SDNY was being asked to do by the Trump administration that were a little bit not legal, extra legal. And it's not really that. A lot of the book, so for example, Jeffrey Berman was at the helm when the SDNY charged Jeffrey Epstein, for example, and Michael Cohen as well, I believe. Again, at this point, I've read some of these books months ago, but what I do know and I can tell you is that you think it's definitely going to be this one thing, but a lot of it is also Jeffrey Berman saying, while I was there, we did a lot of really, really good work, and these are the high-profile cases that I worked on and helped the SDNI work on while I was there. And then the through line through that kind of episodic way the book is structured by chapter is some of the pressure that was being exerted again by the Trump administration while the SDNY was either charging or investigating people related to the Trump administration, and why, Jeffrey Berman eventually decided that he had to go because even though he was a Republican, he just felt like what he was being asked to do was not legal, and just decided, that's it, I'm gonna go. If you want to learn more about this book, like I said, there is a interview between him and Jon Stewart that is on Jon Stewart's YouTube page that you can watch. But the extra reason that this book then became super interesting to me was a book that I picked up later on that talked about the differences between the SDNY, which is what Jeffrey Berman worked for, and this other level, Danny, the district attorney's office for New York. and how those two offices work or don't work together. And I'll tell you what I mean after I tell you what book I'm talking about. So I also read People versus Donald Trump, an inside account by Mark Pomerantz. Now, Danny, if you're like, why does that sound familiar? This is the office now run by Alvin Bragg, who just did do some indicting for the whole like porn star thing in Donald Trump. That was all I knew about Alvin Bragg and this office, just the headlines from that. But reading this book complicates that story and what people were saying about Alvin Bragg that I saw in the newspapers, like, quite a lot. But to return to my earlier point, I grew up in New York. I am from New York State, not from the city, but from the state. And I felt like by reading both Berman and Pomerantz's books together, I was all of a sudden learning way more about the different levels and the legal situation in New York. You know, they cover a lot of really, really high profile cases. So, and there's like different levels, right? There's civil, there's criminal, there's different officers, there's a whole thing. I'm not even sure if I have that acronym right, because there's also a whole other office that is talked about in both of them that it intersects with. Like, don't take my word on anything legal. Just understand that all of a sudden, I don't know, I think I thought of like the legal system, particularly at least within a state, to be slightly more cohesive than these books revealed it to be. And that was really interesting to read, even though those books didn't mean it, to put them side by side and see how they talked about the other office. The Mike Pomerantz book just specifically was about basically the indictment of Trump that never was. That Mike Pomerantz, he had actually worked for SDNY for a bit. He'd done some other legal stuff. He'd never worked for Danny before, and he was brought in to work on a case for the head of Danny prior to Alvin Bragg. And they were going to do some stuff with like funds. It was very like legal, economic payments, this, that, everything else. And basically what ends up happening is that they do all of this work on this case that people think will never work, and Mike Pomerantz and his team get it to a place where they think, no, actually this will work, and Alvin Bragg torpedoes it, which becomes interesting when you realize that Mike Pomerantz and a whole bunch of people from this old team resign, and then like months later Alvin Bragg brings the actual indictment. It's very interesting, and I think that it contextualizes some of the back-working inner politics of that office and what maybe led to that indictment more. And again, I don't understand half of these legal ins and outs, especially being so far removed from having finished these books, but I just like, I read both of them and I was just like, I don't understand the legal system in New York at all. At all. Following that, I also was like scrolling through Libby, my app from the library, and I saw a book come up written by a name that I was like, why is that familiar? And I went, oh, he's the lawyer from The Staircase. If you do not know, The Staircase is a very, very popular true crime documentary series. It was originally filmed by a French company. They then did like extended episodes as the case dragged on, and now it's on Netflix. I don't know if and where it was before that. And I believe HBO did a fictionalized version of the events of it as well. But The Staircase is one of the most interesting true crime documentary series I've ever seen, because it ends up being so much less about the case than the criminal justice system itself. And so when I saw this book, and it's called American Injustice: Inside Stories from the Underbelly of the Criminal Justice System by David Rudolph, I said, oh my God, the lawyer who did this, all this stuff in The Staircase, is writing a book. And I kind of thought initially that it might be a lot about The Staircase, and I was like, oh, I don't know if that's going to be of interest to me because I watched the whole documentary series. The whole Staircase case comes up in this very briefly. Really, what Rudolph is doing in this book is giving you stories from, again, the underbelly of the criminal justice system in cases that Rudolph has been involved in, both when he lived more in the Northeast and then after he moved down south to the Carolinas. And it is stories from decades of work in the criminal justice system, and really just showing how the criminal justice system sometimes does not work. And it's about, you know, some of the stuff that came up in this staircase was like abuse of DNA or physical evidence. There's some police manipulation, a bunch of stories about people being wrongly convicted, particularly in the South, African-American men being convicted for crimes that they didn't commit. You know how sometimes when you're like, oh, this person is like a media personality, or, oh, well, David Rudolph was a lawyer, and so this book might not be that well written? David Rudolph is an incredible writer. And like I said, there's all these different stories, so they function chapter by chapter by chapter, with some threads being pulled all the way through. And some of them are changes in the system that he has seen over time, but also things like with new physical evidence stuff that you can do, some new tactics that are being used. David Rudolph's point is not, of course, that, you know, all cops are bad, but simply that there are some things in place that, because we haven't had criminal justice reform, these are areas where the system is rife for manipulation if people want to do that. And again, just these episodic chapters that are so well written, and you feel so much for all of the people in them, the stories that he weaves through the whole thing, and then he bookends it also really well, kind of starts with a case and then finishes with a case. And it was just so well written. I did talk about this book in the first reading roundtable episode that we did, so I don't want to go on and on and on about it. But I picked it up kind of on a whim. Again, the law, criminal justice system, like, I believe in criminal justice reform, but the ways the law works, like, I don't really understand. It's not an area that I read a lot about, and I felt like within this book, I got a really fast, really well-written primer on a lot of different issues and some laws that could need reform, or some stories that I hadn't known about. And again, just so well written. I was shocked, honestly. So if criminal justice system reform is something that you're interested in learning about, or I would say just like criminal justice, like in general, in a very almost fiction written way, this is a great book for that. Moving on to a very different arena for our laws and justice system, I also read 9 Black Robes, Inside the Supreme Court's Drive to the Right and Its Historic Consequences by Joan Biskupic. I found out about this book because there was an article that talked about this book and one called The Shadow Docket by an author I currently cannot remember, and I put both of them on hold at the same time, really wanting the Shadow Docket book. That still has not come through. There are way more holds on it, but this one did come through, and I decided, you know, what the heck, I'll read it. I've seen some reviews of this that are like, well, this book doesn't tell me anything new. And I understand why people have said this about this book, because basically it chronicles a couple of the older conservative justices that are no longer on the Supreme Court and their differences to when the story really picks up, which is during the Trump administration and the number of Supreme Court justices, 3, that Donald Trump was able to appoint, which has now brought a conservative supermajority to the court. A lot of the stuff, the way that it's talking, like what it's talked about, what they're talking about, is basically stuff that's already been reported, essentially, stringing together news stories, different things, rehashing, for example, all of their confirmations, the Christine Blasey Ford accusations towards Brett Kavanaugh, you know, the mirror of that with Clarence Thomas, and the, again, what happened with Merrick Garland versus Amy Coney Barrett. So all of this has been in the news, it's been discussed in the news, and it's presented in a way which is like basically narrativizing that kind of coverage. So if you are a very close court watcher and you're like, I already know all of this stuff, this may not be an interesting book for you. What I will say, as someone who is individually aware of many of these news items, but has not necessarily thought about them in a continuum sense, I think this book does a really, really good job in isolating basically the changes that have gone on in the Supreme Court and the impact that the new politicization, the new media scrutiny has brought to the court. And again, just putting these things, which in my mind are individual instances of, you know, again, what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, what happened with Amy Coney Barrett, and now seeing them narrativized in a continuum and thinking about it as something that has impacts and echoes and, you know, ripple effects also into the future. So again, if you really read a lot about the Supreme Court, there's probably nothing new in this for you. But if you are interested in a good book that basically encapsulates what's gone on in the court in the last 10 years or so, a little less, it might be useful for that purpose. So my last book is only tangentially related to the law, but I did want to talk about it in this because I think it's relevant, and here's why. The book is called Dinners with Ruth, a memoir on the power of friendship by Nina Totenberg. Now, the Ruth in this title refers to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so you see the connection, the Supreme Court thing we're doing here. Nina Totenberg is one of the founding mothers of NPR, National Public Radio, and one of my favorite contributors to the NPR Politics podcast, where she has been one of the, if not the, original court watcher, the person who basically made the Supreme Court her beat and has been there for decades. And she had a very close personal relationship and friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the subtitle is really what this book is about, less the title. And what I mean by that is it calls itself Dinners with Ruth, but really it is a memoir about Nina Totenberg's life, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of pops up as it goes along. That does mean that we do hear a lot about the Supreme Court, changes to the court, other people that Nina Totenberg has known on the court, and the friendships that she's had with them. But there's also just a lot of personal stories, things about Nina's life. So if you're not connected with Nina as a person, I don't know if this book will be what you wanted if you came because Ruth Bader Ginsburg is pictured on the cover and is in the title. However, as someone who loves Nina Totenberg, this book made me cry at multiple places. It's so beautiful, it's so personal. I really enjoyed it, and it really did move me and made me think about friendships and the power of connection. And, you know, Nina is older at this point, and so she has had, you know, also grief and death in her life, and the importance of friendship, you know, at all the hard times and the good times too. And it's just, I really loved it. I thought it was very, very sweet. And of course the audiobook is also narrated by Nina Totenberg, which just, I loved. So again, I bring it up here because I think some people have definitely picked it up because they thought there would be more RBG in it than there is. And so you might be like, oh, this is going to be all of this like inside the Supreme Court gossip. It's not really what it is. But for what it actually is, this friendship memoir, beautiful, 5 stars, no notes. So I don't know when you guys are going to see this. It's possible that the entire season outside could be different when you finally do, but I just wanted to tell you guys about all of these weird law books that I've been reading, like justice, criminal justice, Supreme Court books. Again, I have that Shadow Docket book that at this point I haven't read yet, and so I'm sure we'll be doing this again sometime soon. But that is all that I have for you guys for this supplemental, so thank you very much for watching, and have a great day. Bye!